I think in the eyes of our allies, it remains an important treaty, but the next point I make in my testimony is whether this treaty regime is likely to survive over the long term is open to serious question. And we have to understand what this treaty does. It imposes an obligation on the United States and then 4 of the successor countries to the Soviet Union not to possess this class of missile. For the United States, that's not an enormous problem, but for Russia, which is surrounded by other countries that are deploying missiles of that range, it is a big problem, and the Russians have made that clear consistently for a period of about 10 years. They made it clear to me personally when I was serving in the U.S. government as the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control. They feel this is an unfair treaty. You know, why should China be able to have these missiles and not them? Why should North Korea and Iran be able to have these kinds of missiles? One of the points I'd make to them, of course, was that part of the reason North Korea and Iran have these kinds of missiles is because Russia transferred to them the technology to produce them. But Russia's attitude toward this treaty is symptomatic of their larger approach to arms control. I think the Obama administration would like the Russians to have a very different approach to arms control. The administration has a very ambitious arms control agenda. Unfortunately, they don't have a partner who shares that agenda, and I make that point at some length in my testimony. But what I'd say is the Obama administration needs to stop worrying about its own arms control agenda. It needs to accept the reality of Russia. I mean, Russia is not committed. Russia does not share President Obama's vision of eliminating nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. They're not particularly fond of arms control agreements. My sense, and it's only a sense, is that the Obama administration has not wanted to confront the violations that we're here to discuss because they're inconvenient from the perspective of trying to advance a broader arms control agenda.
Reports that Russia is circumventing and or violating the INF Treaty suggest that it may be engaged in arms control salami slicing, that is, slowly undermining the INF Treaty through ambiguous infractions rather than exiting the treaty through outright abrogation. The United States cannot permit Moscow to make a soft exit from the INF Treaty while itself remaining a party to the treaty in good standing. It must ensure robust monitoring, verification, and compliance with the treaty as long as it remains in force. But the United States must also look beyond an era of Eurocentric bilateral U.S.-Russian arms control. It must adopt a more multilateral framework consistent with the strategic aim of rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific region. China, ultimately, if the United States is neither able to ensure Russia's compliance nor subsequently to multilateralize or amend the treaty, it may conclude that INF no longer serves its interests. Paradoxically, an American willingness to contemplate the possibility of withdrawal may increase U.S. bargaining leverage in negotiating multilateralization or amendment. The United States should begin creating military options now to backstop diplomacy and ensure the United States can negotiate from a position of strength on Russian compliance, multilateralization, and or amendment of the treaty, while hedging against the failure of these efforts. In conclusion, suspected Russian violations of the INF Treaty come at a time of great strategic uncertainty for the United States on a global basis. While compliance issues must be swiftly addressed, the United States should also widen its aperture for evaluating the INF Treaty to ensure that it serves its broader global interests and security commitments. A treaty that bars 2 nations from pursuing certain militarily desirable classes of missiles, while not stopping other states, some of whom pose threats towards the United States and its allies overseas, from possessing them, must be constantly reevaluated to determine the tipping point when the costs of arms control overtake its benefits.
A Russian violation of the INF Treaty would be a serious matter, as would any treaty violation. If Russia is producing, testing, and or deploying new intermediate-range missiles, such weapons would, depending on their range and deployment location, pose a threat to U.S. allies in Europe and Asia, as well as to other countries such as China. They would threaten U.S. forward-based forces. Such missiles, however, likely would not have the range to reach the United States. Maintaining the INF Treaty remains in the U.S. interest. America and its allies greatly value the agreement. If the U.S. government were to conclude that Russia has violated the treaty, it should press Russia to end the violation and come back into full compliance using both senior diplomatic channels and the Special Verification Commission established by the treaty. Moreover, if Russia has violated the INF Treaty, the United States should nevertheless continue to observe the treaty's provisions, at least for the near term. U.S. withdrawal from the treaty would free Russia from any legal obligation to observe the treaty's limits and would bring no apparent advantage to the United States. At present, the Pentagon has no plans for land-based intermediate-range missiles, so a U.S. withdrawal from the treaty would leave Russia free to deploy missiles for which the United States has no counterpart. Deploying new intermediate-range missiles would take time and impose a new burden on the stretched Defense Department budget. Funding a new missile would require drawing funds from other accounts, such as modernization of strategic nuclear forces, missile defense, or conventional weapon systems. Mr. Chairman, Representative Cooper, distinguished members of the committee, continuing to observe the INF Treaty while pressing for the compliance issue with Russia and having others do so makes sense, at least for the foreseeable future. This does not mean that if Russia has wantonly violated the treaty, the United States should continue to observe it indefinitely, but for now there is no compelling interest on the American part in withdrawal.
Okay. Should the U.S. be concerned about the new Russian missiles like the RS-26 Rubizay, which Russia had tested at intermediate range, but Russia is calling an ICBM? Or should we be content that Russia promises us that it will agree to count the missiles under the New START treaty?
Well, I think as Ambassador Pifer acknowledged that the RS-26 may not in fact be a violation of the treaty, but it certainly should be of concern to the United States and its allies, given the fact that it could be used at intermediate range and therefore would have greater responsiveness and shorter time of flight and the threat that could pose.
Okay, Russia will be preparing to deploy this system in 2015 in Irkutsk, suggesting that for an intermediate range missile, the target is China. Now, what does this do to claims that Russia is breaking out of the INF due to U.S. missile defense?
If the Russians were to deploy the RS-26 in Irkutsk, first of all, it would be an ICBM because it was tested in excess of 5,500 kilometers. That could not reach the United States. But certainly I think a deployment in Irkutsk would suggest very clearly that it is aimed at China and ought to be a concern first and foremost of the Chinese. I'd make one other point about the RS-26 from just a U.S. point of view is, of course, the RS-26, every one that is deployed, takes a space under the New START limit and takes a space that could be deployed by, say, an SS-27 or Bulava missile, which actually could reach all of the United States.
I don't feel that I know enough about the nature of that test to be able to say whether that turns it into an ICBM. The basic physics of missiles is that their range depends on a combination of the amount of thrust they can generate and the weight of the missile. And by adjusting the weight, if you reduce the weight, you can make it go further.
So you're saying that there's a loophole in the INF Treaty that lets them call an IRB?
I mean, I think there may well be in this case because the definition of a ground-launched ballistic missile under the treaty is that it's capable of that it's a weapons delivery vehicle. Now, if you take the warhead off of a missile, it will fly further than if it has a warhead on it. So, it could be that this is a 5,500 kilometer range missile with a warhead. Remove the warhead, it'll fly further.
When one of the questions we asked ourselves is, if the Soviets signed the INF Treaty and get rid of all of their SS-20 intermediate range missiles, how would they cover time-urgent targets in Europe, for example, air bases hosting American nuclear weapons? And the conclusion within the U.S. government was they would take intercontinental ballistic missiles and fly those missiles to intermediate range. So this was a sort of a scenario that was envisaged and was seen as something that they could do and was not seen as a problem with the INF Treaty. And that's why I would recommend that if the U.S. government concludes that the treaty has been violated, that a major focus should be briefing allies. We want to have Chancellor Merkel raising this with Mr. Putin. We want to have President Xi raising it with Mr. Putin. We want to have it, this is an issue that concerns the allies first and foremost. And rather than making it just a bilateral issue, we're going to make this a multilateral question. And then finally, just a general observation. I think you've seen over the last several years the Russian doctrine evolve to slightly greater reliance on nuclear weapons, in part because they see the advances that the American military has made with precision-guided conventional weapons on missile defense. And I think their perception is that that gap is not growing. That gap is perhaps even increasing. So unfortunately, in the last few years, they've come to place greater reliance on nuclear weapon systems.
I would like to inject into the discussion the fact that we also need to be mindful of the Russian tactical nuclear weapons that are deployed in Europe. The numbers are classified, but I think most estimates are that Russia has about a 10-to-1 advantage over NATO in terms of the number of tactical nuclear weapons. And you combine that with what is evidently movement toward the deployment of these types of missiles, which could deliver those tactical nuclear weapons. And I agree with you entirely. Our allies should be much more alarmed than they are.
So my question is this administration going to call what Russia is doing now a violation of the INF? Do you think that they will stand up and say it's a violation? And if they do, will they inform the Congress of that fact and the American people and our Article 5 NATO allies before they inform Russia? Will they stand up in this situation, or will they do as they've done in the litany I've just outlined, Mr. Rademaker?
I hope they will. Again, according to the New York Times, they concluded there was a likely violation in 2011. There have been 2 arms control compliance reports submitted to the Congress since then, neither of which has mentioned this issue. Another one was due on April 15th of this year. It may be forthcoming soon, and I think that will be an interesting test of the question you ask, whether they're prepared to confront this in the forthcoming arms control compliance report.
Is there anyone on the panel that would say that they believe that the Russians have violated the INF or have not? Mr. Rademaker, do you believe that the Russians at this point have in fact violated the INF?
Assuming what I've read in the news media is true, yes, it sounds like a violation, frankly, a material breach of the obligations that Russia has under the INF Treaty.
Based on what's been reported already in Western reports, as well as even within Russia's own media, there are good reasons to believe that Russia may indeed have violated the INF Treaty.
I do not know. Based on what I've seen in open sources, I do not believe the RS-26 is a violation of the INF Treaty. There's a much more serious concern, apparently, about the cruise missile question.
Continue in the former mode of just bilateral negotiations with us and Russia, where China is left out, or should we include them in any future arms control agreements?
At some point, if the U.S. and Russia continue to come down, you've got to bring in third countries.
Or if they continue to come up.
Or if they continue to come up, correct. But I think there still would be room for at least one more U.S.-Russia reduction before you had to get into the more complicated issue of third countries. If I
How long should the U.S. continue to unilaterally be bound by the INF Treaty? We are at present apparently the only party complying with the treaty. Do we let this drag on for 6 years? In some ways, it already reportedly has drug on too long. What do you think?
I don't think we should respond to what we know Russia to have done at this point by pulling out of the treaty. I think from a Russian perspective, that would be more of a reward than a punishment, because from my personal dealings with them, I know that they would very much like to get out from under the treaty, and so I think they would welcome a U.S. decision to withdraw, because that would obviate the need for them to withdraw. That said, I suppose we need to be mindful of what they are doing. We need to pay close attention, and it could be that at some point they step across a line that does jeopardize our security, and at that point, of course, we would have to take measures that might include withdrawing from the treaty and deploying countermeasures either in the area of missile defense or our own INF range missiles.
Well, on that point, how would you define a difference between a violation and a material breach?
I mean, the international law on that question is set forth in Article 60 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and I can just read you what it says. It says, a material breach of a treaty consists in the violation of a provision essential to the accomplishment of the object or purpose of the treaty. So, I think the difference between a material breach and or let me put it this way, the difference between a violation that is a material breach and a violation that is not a material breach is that one that is a material breach is one that violates a provision essential to the accomplishment of the object or purpose of the treaty. And so then you have to look at what is the object and purpose of the treaty to determine what a material breach might be. I think the object and purpose of the INF Treaty is fundamentally to forbid the parties to possess or test INF range missiles. The allegation in the New York Times article was that Russia has tested an INF range treaty. So if that allegation were true, I think that would rise to the level of a material breach. Now, I guess I should distinguish between reaching an internal legal conclusion that there's been a material breach and a decision to declare to the world or confront the other side with the accusation of a material breach. If the allegations in the New York Times story are true, I think as a legal matter, there is a material breach. What we choose to do on the basis of that information is up to us. Again, I mean, there is relevant international law on this. Just because there has been a material breach does not automatically terminate the treaty. It gives the victim of the breach the right to terminate the treaty, but it doesn't automatically terminate it. In other words, it creates a situation where the treaty becomes voidable, but not necessarily void.
Mm-hmm.